Hey, Fort Hays Challenge. It's good to be with you for your life groups. My name is David Manner. I'm the Executive Director for Kansas-Nebraska Convention of Southern Baptists. Wish I could be with you on campus, as I have a couple times before, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that again. For our life group teaching this time, we're going to talk about the subject and the topic of worship. We often think of worship as something we do when we gather together to sing our songs for challenge or gather on our Sundays or our weekend services. But worship is much more than singing a few songs each week. There's a documentary that came out a number of years ago about Mother Teresa. And they interviewed a priest who had known Teresa from her early days as being a nun. And he said this: people say Mother Teresa went to Calcutta and was moved by the plight of all those people in need there and responded because of those feelings. And he said that was not it. It was because she loved God that she responded the way she did. So worship changed her, and the consequences changed the world. We're going to look at a passage in Mark chapter 12, beginning with verse 28. And in this passage here, the chief priests and the elders were gathered together, and Jesus was in their presence, and they were asking him pointed questions to try to catch him or stick him so that they could potentially then arrest him. And so they're asking these questions, which brings us to verse 28. And the text says that one of the scribes, in Mark chapter 12, verse 28, one of the scribes approached. When he heard them debating, and the other teachers of the law debating, and saw that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, which command is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Jesus, I believe, immediately had their attention. I believe that in that moment, when he quoted that text, he had them in the palm of his hand. When he said, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Because those words are the beginning words of the Shema. Observant Jews considered the Shema to be the most important part of the prayer service in Judaism. It was a declaration of their faith. In fact, it was so sacred to them, in an act of humility, they would actually cover their eyes in an act of humility as they quoted those words, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It was traditional for Jews to say the Shema as the last words of their life, if possible. And they would teach that text to their children and pass that on to other generations, so that their children would quote those words before they go to bed at night, much like our kids, that we train them to learn those prayers so they can say that before bedtime. So Jesus responded by saying, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Then he continues in verse 30. And this is the more familiar passage of this. And Jesus says, in response to the greatest commandment, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is, love your neighbor as yourself. There's no other command greater than these. So Jesus challenged those he was teaching in that moment with 5 things that I think are going to be a challenge for us as we consider this understanding of worship. The first is this: worship means we love God with all our heart. You see, the heart is often a symbol of our emotions or how we feel. When we have a relational breakup, we often say our heart is broken. And we are grieving, we often say that our heart is heavy or we're heavy-hearted. When we're happy, we often say our heart is full. But in fact, worship that's contingent on a musical experience alone, that just stirs our feelings, may not be worship at all, but instead nostalgia. And nostalgia is that time or that period when happy or meaningful personal recollections are stirred because of an experience or a feeling or something that occurs to us. Nostalgia can cause us to romanticize or idealize and maybe even embellish those past worship experiences. And so if those past experiences or feelings are not elicited again because we maybe don't know or particularly like the songs, maybe the ones that Cameron has chosen for that particular week, we can even leave challenge or the worship service believing worship couldn't and didn't occur. As a result of that, we sometimes attempt to recreate those divine moments or events, or even complete seasons based almost completely on the feelings that were originally stirred, and we call that worship. Also, if our worship is just based on feelings alone, then novelty, in addition to nostalgia, novelty is also a danger. Novelty is that quality of being new or original or unusual just to be new or original or unusual. So a novelty entertains for a short period of time until another novelty surfaces. When college freshmen come to college for the first time, it's novel to be away from their parents, to have that independence from their family until they have to do their laundry for the first time. And a child's birthday is, those birthday presents are novel, or they're novelties until he or she opens the next present. So novelty can cause us to over-innovate as worshipers and worship leaders, to over-innovate and over-stimulate and even over-imitate. Then each time we worship becomes, or can become, an exercise in trying to surpass the creativity from the previous Sunday. So when excessive worship novelty occurs, our focus is often on listen to this, the creative instead of the creator. Worship is indeed emotional, but it's more than just a feeling stirred up by the songs we sing and the songs that we play. A second point Jesus makes also parallels the first one when he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And the second is, worship means that we love God with all our soul. Loving God with all our soul means that worship occurs from the inside out, not the outside in. Sometimes we get that backwards. Sometimes we invert that. See, our souls must reflect our relationship with Jesus. So worship is not just our attempts to be with Jesus by singing these songs. Worship is our response to already having been with Jesus. It's hard to respond to or worship Jesus if you haven't spent time with him. And true worship does not begin with our worship actions. True worship begins on the inside, in the depth of our souls, and then it's expressed on the outside or manifested through our worship actions. And again, we've inverted that cause and effect of worship. See, God's revelation is the cause of worship. That's when he offers us a glimpse of his activity and his will and his attributes and his judgment, his discipline, his comfort, his hope, his promises. Our response then is the effect. Cause and effect. The effect is that sometimes spontaneous and sometimes planned reply to God's revelation, and we call that worship. So what we sing or how we sing it, or what we play, can't cause a response because it is the response. So as good as our various worship actions are, as good as the worship band is, with Cameron leading that for Challenge, those worship actions still can't cause worship to occur because those worship actions are the effect, not the cause. This is huge. This takes the pressure off those worship leading teams. And it takes the pressure off Cameron and the other Challenge worship leaders to create worship themselves each week. And it should also remove those expectations that the music did or didn't allow us to worship. Now, those worship actions and our worship leaders may prompt and remind and exhort and prod and encourage more effect, but they can't cause. We can acknowledge the cause, but we can't generate it. And we can respond to that cause, but we can't initiate it. And we can celebrate that cause, but we can't create it. God has called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. He's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light that we might what? Declare his praises. He calls and we declare. The Father is seeking, meaning he initiates that relationship. He's seeking the kind of worshipers who worship in spirit and in truth. He's waiting for us to respond to his revelation. He is calling us out of darkness, and he initiates that, and we respond. When I was a child, we used to travel from Oklahoma to Tennessee to see my grandparents, and they lived on a farm in Tennessee. And as we would turn the corner to go down to their farmhouse at the bottom of the hill, inevitably, my grandmother would be in the porch swing watching for us, longing for us to arrive, waiting for us. She'd been there for hours, long before we got there, looking for us and longing for us. That was before cell phones, so we didn't have to wait to call her ahead of time and say we were about there. And so she'd been waiting there for hours. This understanding is that our worship doesn't invite or generate God's presence. It acknowledges it. He was there long before we arrived. Our songs don't determine whether he shows up or not. He's expectingly waiting for us to respond. He's looking for us to respond to him and to his presence. The third thing that Jesus says is that worship means we love God with all of our minds. We often wait for the first song to occur in whatever meeting we're in, challenge or our church services, to engage in worship. But worship requires more than just an emotional response. It also requires mental preparation. We could again learn a lot from the Jews who believed that the Sabbath begins at sundown the evening before they actually gather for worship. So the things with which they fill their minds, which we fill our minds, and who we're with before we gather for worship, what we watch and what we do and how we prepare before gathered worship, could negatively or positively impact our worship as we gather. In his letter to the church at Philippi, Paul exhorted them that whatever is true and whatever is noble and whatever is right and whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, this long litany he goes through. And I think he finally just says, as the text says, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, meaning worth our worship, think about such things. Love the Lord your God with all your minds. When our daughter was about 5 years old, we took her to Disney World for the first time. And she was so excited. We did the big reveal to her a couple of months ahead of time, and she couldn't wait till we actually flew to Florida to go to Disney World. And she had been thinking about it, pondering on it, and meditating on it for months. And when we finally arrived in Florida, in Orlando, and we stayed in the hotel the night before, the first day we were supposed to go to the park, she was so excited that she laid her clothes out on the bed beside hers so that the next morning when she got up, she could jump in those clothes like a firefighter going to a fire. And she inhaled her breakfast. She woke hours before we had to leave to go to the park. And she was ready long before we could even get there. If we had left when she was ready, we'd be there hours before they opened the gates. And once we arrived, she was so excited. And the reason was she'd been thinking about it and dreaming about it and planning and preparing for it. She'd been longing for it, and her mind was so focused on it that she couldn't sleep because of the excitement. What if we had that same attitude about worship, not only as we gather, but also as we disperse? That we couldn't wait until we get to show up with those other people that are worshiping with us so that we can engage our minds in that worship. The fourth thing that Jesus says is that worship means we love God with all of our strength. See, worship is a verb. It's something we do, not something that's done for us. The Challenge worship team can't worship for us. It's something we do. Paul wrote in Romans 12, verse 1, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual and proper and true act of worship." See, loving God with our strength means that we offer all of ourselves to Him, not just our voices in singing. We offer our physical strength and our abilities and our time and our talent, our resources. Loving God with all our strength means that we need to sacrifice. It requires sacrifice, or offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. But worship sacrifice is only possible if our common ground when we gather for worship is deference instead of preference. Deference is that willingness to set aside our own selfish desires and preferences because we love those with whom we worship and serve and sing more than we love getting our own way. My dad passed away just a few months ago at the age of 89. When he was 75, my dad contracted West Nile virus and was in the hospital for 100 days, almost died, and recovered mentally, but physically he never recovered the use of his legs. And so he was in a wheelchair for the last 15 years of his life. And when my mother and dad would go anywhere, to go to church, go to the store, go to a restaurant, my dad would wheel his powered chair up to the side door and he could pull himself into the car. And then my mother, who was also in her 70s and 80s at that time, would have to go around and bring that powered wheelchair around the back of the car for the lift that was on the back of the car, and she would wheel that on the lift, and she would strap it on there, and she would raise it up, and then when they would arrive at their destination, she'd have to do the same thing in reverse. So for 15 years, my mother did that every time they went anywhere. If you were to ask my mom if that would have been the preference for how she would have liked to have spent the last 15 years with my dad, obviously that wouldn't have been her preference. But see, my mom was willing to sacrifice that preference because she loved my dad more than she loved that preference. So loving God with all our strength, or offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, may not mean that we have to sacrifice like my mom did. But it does mean that we need to be willing to set aside our preferences, even musical preferences, and our desires, and even our favorite songs that we like, for the sake of others. A baseball bunt is a sacrifice in order to advance another runner. And executing that bunt is actually called laying down a bunt. What if we had the same attitude about our worship preferences? We're willing to lay those down in order to advance somebody else. That's the living sacrifice. The fifth and final thing that Jesus talked about is that worship means we also love our neighbors. Worship is not just what we do in here when we gather for worship. It's also who we are out there when we scatter. The second part of the commandment in this passage that Jesus challenged them and us with, and what he said was equal to loving him with heart, soul, mind, and strength, is that we're able to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. It doesn't matter how good our worship is when we gather in here, it's insincere and incomplete until it also includes how we treat our neighbors out there. So worship doesn't end when we sing the last song in challenge or the last song in our worship service and then begin again when we gather together and sing again together the next week. In fact, how we treat the restaurant server, if we go to a restaurant after challenge, after we've had that worship time together, how we treat the restaurant server when we go to get some food after challenge is also an act of worship. How we treat our roommates and our parents and our professors is also an act of worship. See, we're missing what it means to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength when we expend all of our worship resources on a weekly gathering and have nothing left for what should be a daily occurrence. Let me end with this illustration. Early nomadic people, before they created fire and they were able to get that fire, and because of that laborious task of that early fire starting a fire from scratch, those early nomadic people began to develop, and they created these earthenware vessels called fire pots. And the nomadic people could carry, what they would do is at the end of the night, as they would sleep through the night, and often they would move camp from one place to another from day to day. And so the next morning they would get up, and that fire that had been burning through the night, they would take some of the embers from that fire and they would put it in those fire pots, and they would add kindling to those fire pots throughout the day as they were traveling from one location to another, so that when they arrived at the new camp, all they had to do was take some of those embers that they carried with them and add some kindling to that, and pretty soon they had a raging fire. So each time that they went to a new location, they didn't have to start a fire from scratch. What if we had that same understanding of worship and saw it not as a fire that the worship team starts from scratch each week in challenge, but instead that we saw it as embers or a flame or a spark that we take with us, meaning that it continues then when we leave challenge each week. It can happen in our homes and in our relationships. It can happen through our classes and with our professors and other students, and it can happen in our work responsibilities. And that means worship wouldn't be contained in a single location or a context or culture or style or artistic expression or a vehicle of communication. Then what would occur when we gathered on Sunday worship, or when we gathered for challenge for those times of worship? Instead of depending on our worship leaders to start that fire from scratch, they could just fan those flames that already exist. Scripture says, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth." Worship is continuous. just depending on whom or what you're worshiping. Can you imagine what kind of worship could occur? When you gather for challenge each week or with your church on Sunday, if we as Christ followers could learn to love God with our hearts and soul and our mind and our strength, and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, not only when we gather, but also when we scatter. Can you imagine what could occur in our worship when we gather, when we've had that attitude throughout the week? Worship in here would then be an overflow of the worship that has already occurred out there. Can you imagine what that could be like? Loving God, or worship, must spring forth from every aspect of our being, or it may not be worship at all. Thanks. It was great to be with you.